Fitzgerald with AAPCA, and we're so happy to have you all join us. I think that we have a good presentation here today, and we look forward to well, the presenters and your questions. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. We want to be respectful of everyone's time and try to stay on schedule. So as I said, my name is Rebecca Fitzgerald, and I'm the Program Manager of Energy and Environmental Policy with the Council of State Governments, but I'm also serving in the role of Research and Administrative Associate for AAPCA. AAPCA is short for the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies. We were created in 2012 as a technical forum to assist states with the application of various aspects of the Clean Air Act and associated regulations. To date, our membership includes 17 states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Today's training, Understanding Next Generation Compliance and Enforcement, will feature a panelist of 5 experts with diverse expertise that will help us understand how next generation compliance differs from the EPA's current enforcement approach and what the practical implications are for the state. We have presenters from the EPA who will provide a background on the EPA's latest draft 5-year strategic plan and the Next Generation Compliance Program. We also have a presenter from the Environmental Defense Fund who will provide their views on what next generation compliance means for the NGO community. Texas will present an example of implementing their new technologies with their infrared camera system. And then we also have a legal expert who will speak to some of the legal background and potential legal implications of the remote sensing. Because we have quite a few speakers, I'm going to introduce them individually and provide you with a brief background before each of them speak, or I would be speaking for a while. So with that, I just want to say we're so happy to have each of the speakers here. We appreciate their time. We do look forward to their presentations. I think we've assembled quite an expert panel. Just a couple of logistical points before we get started. First, all the participants are in listen-only mode. We greatly encourage you to submit questions for our speakers. We have 2 designated question and answer sessions for the EPA presentation specifically, and then depending on whether time will allow and we have enough time, we'll also take questions for the additional presenters. You can submit a question. You'll notice with the GoToWebinar application, there's a question box. It's probably most likely on the right-hand side of your screen. You can type that question in there. There's also a chat, but we prefer you to type it in the question box. And then I will read those on a first-come, first-served basis until we no longer have time to take those questions. But feel free to submit as many questions as you'd like, and we'll make sure that we pass them along so we can get those answered for you. We also have provided the those presenters' contact information at the end of the slideshow, and we encourage you to reach out to them as well. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Michelle McKeever. She is the branch chief of the National Planning and Measures Branch in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, also known as the OECA with the EPA. Michelle's branch develops OECA's strategic plan, national performance measures, and guidance to the EPA's regions and states for implementing OECA's priorities. Her branch also coordinates OECA's national enforcement initiative, compiles OECA's annual results data, and participates in enforcement targeting analysis. Michelle started her career at the EPA in 1991 as an economist in the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, preparing brief cost analysis of new air quality regulations. She also has worked as congressional liaison for the EPA. With that, I will turn it over to you, Michelle.
Okay, hello, this is Michelle McKeever, and I'm here to describe to you what we have included in our 5-year strategic plan, which is currently still a draft plan. It went out for public comment during the November 19 to January 3, and since then we have tried to incorporate, make edits, incorporate some of the comments that we received agency-wide, and it's currently still floating around within our agency and at OMB for review. This is a 5-year plan, so it covers FY 14 to 18, and in it we have we talk about our priorities for the next 5 years. We include an explanation of next generation compliance concepts and ideas, and we include ideas for performance measures that will quantify the effectiveness of our work, since this is an investment area for us. And then we also include numerical targets for those performance measures. In the strategy, we also explained that we've made some policy choices given our budget constraints and the limits that we can do with our enforcement program. And some of those policy choices talk about focusing our work on the largest and most complex cases to address the most serious pollution problems. And that affects some of the numbers that the targets that we have for those performance measures that are included in the strategic plan. During the comment period, I get a lot of questions about what kind of comments we received. We got quite a lot of comments about the targets that we had. These performance measures are traditional level of activity efforts, numbers of inspections and evaluations that we do, numbers of cases that we initiate or conclude, pounds of pollution that we get from these cases that we take. Over that 5-year period, we did show a decline compared to a lower target compared to what we had predicted, say, for the previous strategic plan, which was over the last 5-year period. So we received a lot of comments on that, and it was good to see that people support a strong enforcement program. And so using those comments, and also in the meantime with the budget getting passed by the Hill for the next 2 years, we were able to readjust some of our targets using that new information for that 5-year period. So as I said, it's still in review at this time, so I can't say what the final is exactly going to look like. But at least you can see a draft if you are interested. I think that version is still available for just for viewing, but not commenting on. One of the important things that we introduced, though, in the strategic plan was this investment area called next generation compliance. And the reason I talked about our traditional performance measures first is that because we have this new investment area for next gen, we want to try to show the progress that we're making towards implementing next gen. The problem with that is that when we look at designing regulations that are easier to implement, these are the tenets, the 5 areas of next gen: designing regulations, using advanced emission technology, shifting towards more electronic reporting, expanding transparency, and developing more innovative approaches towards enforcement. Those areas are very difficult to quantify. So we're not there yet in terms of an end goal in implementing next gen, so we don't have lots of e-reported data that's electronically reported, So we're looking at an interim period where we're in the process of implementing NextGen. So how can we quantify that progress that we're making? Well, within the strategic plan, we included some examples of ideas that we might be able to incorporate into some of our performance measures. Some of those include counting the number of enforcement settlements that incorporate advanced monitoring technologies, looking at the regulated sources and counting those using advanced monitoring technologies, counting somehow the public use of the compliance transparency tools that we have, such as our pollutant loading tool or ECHO, which a lot of you probably are familiar with. So we floated those ideas out for public comment. They're not official measures that we have that we report through GPRA, the Government Performance and Results Act. But we wanted to get a feel for what people thought about these measures, and as we're continuing to work on it, we'll continue to refine some of these ideas and think about where we're going to get some of this data to report on our progress. So that's it for the performance measures. We received some comments on the measures saying that it's a good idea, but people were worried that this was going to somehow replace our traditional enforcement program. It is not. We clearly recognize that this is a supplement to making our enforcement program a more effective program. But it's where we're headed in terms of the new technologies and the data. So with that, I will conclude my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Michelle. At this point, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So you mentioned approximately, you guys are working through this as a draft, and I know you stated at the beginning kind of what your timeline was, but I know we also had some people joining. Would you walk us through just that timeline one more time with the draft? And
Sure. I mean, we worked on it last summer. The draft strategic plan covers the period from FY14 to FY8, fiscal years 14 to 18. It went out for public comment from November 19 to January 3rd. Since January, we have worked on revising the document, and as a lot of people know, we do not release any documents until it goes through OMB review. That schedule was held up because the budget was late this year. So that process is sort of kicking off right now. We are behind our original schedule that we set up in terms of wanting to get this out by now. So I think doing it as fast as we can is the schedule that we're living under at this point.
okay, that's helpful. I appreciate you stepping through that. I think everyone's kind of anticipating and knowing that these things take time, but we are looking for kind of when we can expect that. But knowing that you guys are working on, it includes lots of moving parts and pieces, and so I think everyone appreciates the conversations that they have at their regional office levels on some of these things that the strategic plan has that might be new. And we just reiterate that we want to be mindful of just keeping those communication lines open, so we appreciate that.
Thank you. And I want to stress this is a longer-term look at our priorities and activities. We also have the National Program Manager's Guidance, which is an annual, or we're moving to a biannual effort, but that looks more at a yearly list of priorities and activities that we highlight for the regions and the states.
Yeah, and I think that is that in particular is another topic of interest for our members, is that biannual and kind of what that might look like. And so as you guys have a better understanding of what that means for the state, I think it would help to speak to that moving forward. So.
Okay.
Great. Well, originally we weren't quite sure. We wanted to leave enough time for questions, Michelle, and for you to present your information, knowing that this was kind of that intro and that background of where next generation compliance kind of comes from and originates, and the direction for that. But it doesn't look like we have any more questions, and we don't really need to take a break 17 minutes in. So David, if you're ready, I think we can move on there because I'm anticipating quite a few questions for you if you're ready.
I am ready. So can
Great.
you advance?
Appreciate it. Let me introduce you, David. So David is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance at the EPA. He started his career at the EPA office in Washington, D.C., working on water enforcement cases, targeting and national enforcement policies. After 12 years in enforcement, he became the Associate Director of Toxic Release Inventory, also known as TRI program. And TRI, he led the development of the TRI-Me software to guide facilities in electronically reporting their releases of toxic chemicals. In 2003, David returned to the EPA enforcement and held management positions in the Office of Compliance, where he was responsible for modernizing and operation of the National Enforcement Information System, compiling OECA's annual results. He also initiated the creation of a national tool for NPDES, electronic reporting, from permittees, and worked with states to launch the first version of this tool. He was also the lead manager in developing a new initiative among the states and EPA, the Clean Water Action Plan, and its goal was to improve the NPDES program. In 2012, David moved to the immediate office of the OECA and to lead the new initiative, Next Generation Compliance. And so with that, David, we know that you are the expert on this subject, and we do look forward to your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So you should see on slide number 4 on your screen that says why next generation compliance. So let me talk about the drivers and why we're doing this. So when the enforcement office at EPA looks at compliance or non-compliance across multiple sectors, multiple states, we still see substantial non-compliance problems. For many sectors, there's high non-compliance, meaning that we see 25% or more of the facilities in what we would call significant non-compliance. And we also know that when we look at non-compliance and trying to take a national snapshot of it, it's not easy to do because the data is not readily available, because there's not reliable monitoring data from most facilities. We're not able to inspect most facilities often enough to get anything close to statistically valid. So there are a host of issues that say that when we've looked at non-compliance, we usually find serious problems, but we know it's hard to look. So we have that challenge when we look. It's high, and also it's very hard to find the data. We also know that government resources for doing inspections and single facility enforcement actions, and by government I mean states that do most of the inspections, as well as EPA, and in some cases it's inspections by local air pollution control districts as well and others. We know that the old days of being able to send an inspector out to each facility once a year are no longer with us. The universes that we regulate under environmental programs are much bigger than the traditional air majors, the stationary source majors, the NPDES wastewater majors, and the treatment storage disposal units under RCRA. So the universe has grown. You've got stormwater sites, you've got Clean Air Act area sources. So the single facility approach to enforcement is not going to get us to where we want to get. And that means a lot of the benefits that we in the environmental programs in the states and the regions are so working to get, we're probably not getting all those benefits because of noncompliance. And I should emphasize, as Michelle did, is next generation compliance is not instead of enforcement. We in AAPCA still intend to have a vigorous enforcement program to address the most serious violations. That's not going away. We think there will always be a place for enforcement in terms of deterrence. There are serious violations that need to be addressed. So even though I'm going to focus on next generation compliance, it's with the understanding that a traditional single facility program is still very much part of what's on our plates to implement. So I just want to make sure people understand that as I go forward. So the next slide, slide 5. So the next slide, there we go. So there's 5 pieces to next generation compliance. One of the long-term things we're trying to do is the very first piece, which is, can we design more effective rules and permits with compliance built in? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. The second component is advanced monitoring technology. You see on this a picture of a geospatial measure of air pollution vehicle, and you can drive that around to measure methane and VOC emissions. It includes an infrared camera, sampling ports, GPS, methane meter. It's got a variety of technologies. We've got 3 of these at EPA, and they're really effective in finding pollution problems at facilities that the facility didn't even know they had. When we've taken this vehicle onto facilities, we sometimes get the interesting thing where the facility points to their neighbor across the dirt road and said, that's the source of the problem. And sometimes when we go to their neighbor, they are correct, that is the source of the problem. But sometimes when we go to the neighbor, it's not true. It's not the source of the problem. So advanced monitoring technology is a key part of next generation compliance. I'll talk more about that. Getting out of paper reporting and catching up to the rest of the world, electronic reporting is another component. Transparency, how do you promote compliant behavior? How do you give the public more information? How do you drive compliance through transparency? And that's part of it. And also innovative enforcement. Can we take some of these practices on monitoring technology, electronic reporting, and transparency and build them into our enforcement cases? So those are the 5 basic pieces of next generation compliance. On the next slide, and I'm going to do this relatively quickly, I'm going to go over for you our more effective rules permit, the very first component. And there are 5 principles here, and I'm going to go through these in pretty quick status to give you this. We do actually a course. So this slide that you're looking at called More Effective Rules and Permits, there's a 90-minute version of this slide where we go through a bunch of it, and there's also a 4-hour version. And we've trained a lot of EPA staff and even some state staff on how to do effective rules and permits. So I'm just going to cover this briefly. As I said, we've piloted this training with some water states. We may pilot it with some other states. But let me just give you a sense of what more effective rules and permits is about. We've spent a lot of time figuring out what are the basic principles, and you'll see the 5 ones up there, for designing an effective rule or permit. How can you build compliance in? How can you make it easier for the states and EPA regions to implement? And this is not about relaxing environmental standards in any way. It's about thinking about implementation of effectiveness as we develop permits and regulations. So let me go through the 5 principles very briefly, starting on the next slide. So principle 1 is pretty basic, but sometimes we don't quite get it right. And it basically goes to the question of applicability, which is our term for are you able to tell who is covered by the regulation and what they're expected to do? And there's 3 subparts of this. Can you focus on a smaller universe? Can you regulate manufacturers upstream in the process rather than consumers or users? Sort of a supply chain management. As you go up and you have a smaller number of sources it makes it easier for EPA and the states to regulate them. That's not saying that you can do that all the time, but it's something to keep in mind. We also throw out this thing under B, would a simple rule with higher compliance deliver more benefits even if the standard was slightly lower? So if you had a standard, for example, that was 30, but it was really easy to understand, easy for states and EPA regions to implement, and you thought, yeah, given how we structured this rule, we could get 90% compliance. Would that be better than a really complicated rule with lots of subparts and subsections and special provisions for each type of different boiler? And maybe the standard would be on average 20, but compliance might be 50. And you can sort of do the math and figure it out. And we've asked that question. We're not saying that question should always be asked, but this is one principle we'd like people to start thinking about. And the last part of Principle 1 is something people are going to say, well, that's not very new, clear and objective regulatory requirements. And you're right, but it's worth emphasizing whenever we can, because it does continue to cause us problems when we go to enforce, when we try to explain regulations to both EPA inspectors, state inspectors, EPA permit writers, and regulated industry, is that the clearer and better job you can do with Principle 1, the better you get. I'm going to turn to Principle 2 on the next slide. So Principle 2 says, can you sort of make compliance the default, right? Can you build in structures? And there's a small literature on this. So it is possible, if you think of this in terms of speeding, you can slow cars down by putting up signs, right? You can have flashing signs that tell you your speed, but a structural design would be very simple. You've all driven over speed bumps. You can also do these circles. So there are ways, how do you slow people down to comply in terms of traffic without necessarily having to have a police officer on every street block? And there's physical structures in environmental that we can do that as well. Think of a car. A car comes compliance ready, right? So when you buy a new car, you can assume that the air pollution control devices, starting from the catalytic converter going all the way up to the emissions monitoring systems, work. Your job as a consumer when you buy that car is to maintain the system, and if you're in a non-attainment area, you'll occasionally have to take the car in maybe every 2 to 3 years for its emissions to be inspected on an O&M basis. But what we don't do when you buy a new car is we don't say, you, the consumer, go out and figure out how to purchase compliance equipment. We don't send you to like, catalytic converters are us. We don't do that. And we're trying to do that in other regulations too, where we've proposed that if oil and gas exploration companies buy pollution control equipment that has been pre-certified by EPA as compliant, then those facilities don't have to send in an initial compliance determination, do an initial compliance determination, and send all that data into EPA or the states. They get certified that they're installing something that should be compliant. For those of you on the phone, if I had any physical contact, some of you would probably look at me and say, well, what about O&M? That's critical. And the response is, we're not saying that you still don't have to do O&M and provide periodic sampling and monitoring. But if you buy something that's been compliance certified in the beginning, maybe that initial compliance determination could be as easy as an electronic postcard to EPA that says, I bought this piece of equipment, it's certified by manufacturer X, and then we ask the manufacturer of that equipment to annually send us in information indicating that these are the people they sold to. And now we're sort of like, we have two lists. We have a list of the facilities that say they're covered, they bought the compliant equipment, and we have the manufacturers who have sought EPA certification that their equipment is compliant, very similar to cars, and we can compare the two, and that gives us basically a targeted list to say where are their problems. Anyhow, I don't have a lot of time to go into more examples, but that's just one example. Feedback technology, cell phones now will allow you to not only have lights flashing and whistles blowing in plants when there are problems with operations or compliance, but you can also send text messages as well to managers, emails, so you can actually have equipment that's smart enough to relay what's going on right to the person who needs to know, and you can have more than one person get it, of course. Next slide, I'm going to talk about Principle 3. And principle 3 is not terribly new, but I think the cost of it is coming down. Can you create incentives for regulated entities and third parties to assess compliance and take steps to prevent it? So many of you are familiar with periodic self-monitoring, self-certifications. More and more we're looking at third-party compliance. So third parties refer to an independent entity that the regulated source has to use to do a compliance verification. And that independent entity has an obligation to provide the regulatory, either the state or EPA, with the information from that verification. It's not an internal audit, but it's a third-party compliance verification. You're seeing more willingness to consider this, and you're seeing more and more examples of this actually throughout the economy of where the government is having third parties verify compliance. There's a whole host of challenges to make sure the third party is really not the same thing as the regulated entity, so you have to worry about collusion sometimes, and that it doesn't, third-party verification doesn't morph into self-certification. If it does morph into self-certification, then you're back to A on this slide, which is periodic self-monitoring and self-certification. Those are good programs. They've proven to be very helpful. So you just want to make sure you know which one you're doing. Continuous emissions monitoring is no longer just for the big guys. Monitoring technology is now making it for the little guy. And we've also looking at fence line monitoring, which really refers to measuring pollutants in the ambient environment, not just at the point source. And next generation compliance is not just an air pollution, it's water, it's RCRA. So fence line monitoring in the water world would be ambient monitoring of water quality outside the discharge point. What's the water quality like half a mile downstream from these discharges? So principle 4 on the next slide. So this is how, and this one is perhaps one of my favorite principles, that you can drive compliance simply by collecting information and making it publicly accessible. You can create strong incentives. Electronic reporting makes the collection of the information higher quality, less burdensome for the states and EPA and the facility. You're probably all familiar with tax reporting software. Some of you may be using it over the next couple of weeks, or those of you who are really good have already done that. I just loaded mine this last weekend and working through my taxes. So you have smart tools that improve the data quality. They also provide compliance assistance, right? So the regulated entity is receiving help on understanding the regulations and what's required to report. And then you have all this information electronically. It's much easier to share it via websites, other things, social media. There's a lot of different ways to leverage accountability. In our longer course, we go through the transparency literature. We talk about different types of transparency programs and how effective they are. Most of you are probably familiar with EPA's major transparency program, which is miles per gallon. So if you think when you buy a new car, you see at the point of purchase on the window a sticker that gives you miles per gallon. That soon will give you also gallons per mile. Some people think that's a more useful measure, because then you just multiply how many miles you expect to drive in a year, and you automatically can figure out how many gallons of gas you're doing. So that's information at the point of source. And also we give out information such as greenhouse gases, toxics release inventory, where we're giving out information for the analysts. The average everyday person is probably not going to TRI to figure out what's going on. But again, there could be NGOs or other groups that take the data that EPA and states put out and makes it more useful. So the next slide and the last principle to talk about is how do you use benefits and market forces to create other incentives. And there you see a picture of the former EPA administrator looking at a car. I've already talked about the two things that cars stand for, right? At least in terms of next generation compliance. They provide compliance built in through the air pollution control systems, and there's the sticker showing you miles per gallon for transparency. So some of Principle 5 is, can you give the local community the ability to know what's going on so they could encourage compliance? Investors and consumers from labels such as Energy Star or other programs. Acid rain, harness market forces, is perhaps our leading example, tradable emission reductions. And in some cases, you can give benefits to the regulated entities that they otherwise wouldn't be able to obtain. So in some EPA regulations, we can show actually a net savings from certain programs, but it takes 7 years to get there. And the regulated entity in their normal investment might only look at a 3 to 5 year return on investment. So it almost forces a longer return on investment, and you can get benefits in that way. So what I've just talked about, to recap, is the principles for designing effective rules and permits. This is very much a long-term effort on the rule side, because rule development in EPA takes a long time. But it's very much how can we build compliance in. As we build compliance into our regulations, inspections by EPA, inspections by states will become easier to do. And so that's principle one. I'm going to talk about principle two. Now I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk about the second component. And you will see that the 5 components that I'm going to talk about, remember I said there's rule effectiveness and advanced monitoring, they overlap, and that's deliberate, so don't worry about, well, how does this relate to that? They all relate to each other. So often we show a fuzzy line or a Venn diagram. So advanced monitoring technology really has a tremendous value in showing people and showing facilities pollution that they couldn't see. So it takes invisible pollutants, makes them visible. And then the theory would suggest in practice is that when people can see problems, see pollution problems, the source might be able to fix it, might be able to reduce it, prevent it. The government might be easier able to encourage the facility to correct it. And the public has a better chance of also encouraging the facility, or in some cases just saying, this isn't a good day for a run outside. And we won't have a time to talk a little more about that, but advanced monitoring technology is really moving forward. Next slide. The next slide shows you 2 pieces of equipment that EPA routinely uses now, a photoionization detector, which I think is under 5,000, and then an infrared camera, which runs about 100,000. I'm going to assume most of the people on the phone are familiar with this technology, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, other than to say that at some point this technology will become pretty standard for most inspectors in the air program who are looking for these type of pollutants or from these type of sources. So at some point it will become like hiring a carpenter, and the carpenter shows up with a hand drill, right? He doesn't have an electric drill, or she doesn't have it. The technology is becoming more and more commonplace. We're not there yet. We're certainly not at the point where cell phones, are in everybody's possession. But hopefully our inspectors over the next few years, these technologies, these tools will become more commonplace. So the next slide is an example of a flare camera, just in case some people haven't seen this. So on the left, you're looking at the flare camera in its, and I use flare because that's the name of the company. I really shouldn't do that, but there's about 2 or 3 companies. So on the left, the picture that has a little bit of color in it and the blue sky, that's the camera, the infrared camera operating in normal video mode. And then when we turn on the infrared part of it, it now shows you the VOCs leaking out of the top. The wind's blowing from front to behind, so the employee is not being exposed as much as you think, but clearly wouldn't be my favorite place to stand. And I think there was a bad seal or some problem with the top of the tank that was not apparent to the employee until you show them what's going on with the camera. Next slide. So this slide is a very interesting slide because it shows that when we can actually estimate emissions using monitoring equipment, we find that the estimated, so when we can actually, monitor equipment, monitor the emissions, the monitored emissions tend to be higher than what was reported using engineering proxy measures. So these 2 slides show you, there are 2 cases, a case against Marathon and BP. in the left, in the blue, you see what the company was reporting to us and the public in the state about what their emissions were from operating flares. In this case, flare is, as everybody knows, basically an air pollution control device for gases, right? So that's what they were estimating based on estimates of how much steam they were putting in and how much BTUs they had. But when we actually went out and measured using monitoring equipment, they were way off. They were 25 times and 10 times higher. And we've taken a number of these cases now. We just reported one against, the name is escaping me. I was going to say Flint Hills, but it's a case in Texas that we just reported.
That's the one, Flint Hills.
It is
Port Arthur.
Flint Hills, Port Arthur, if you want, you can go look at our website, is another case where we had improper operations of flares. And in that case, the facility is now going to improve their operation of the flares. They're actually also going to take their fence line monitoring data, which they were doing, and make the data public, so there's transparency as well. The next slide is another monitoring slide, and I show this to say that it's not just about air monitoring. This is a buoy in the Charles River in Massachusetts. It's a solar-powered buoy. It communicates electronically using IT, basically cell phone uploads to a regional computer. And it measures about 15 parameters trying to predict when there would be algae blooms. And at some point we will make this publicly available. We're not there yet, but it's getting very, very close. And there are other examples of this as well. So again, as people have real-time information, the government, industry, and the public, we expect environmental protection to be really enhanced. So slide 15 probably summarizes what I've been saying all along, some of the benefits of advanced monitoring. And I don't need to go over this now, but I've said it. But for those of you who are just looking at the slides, this is the promise of advanced monitoring that we're beginning to see in cases and regulations and transparency projects as well. So next slide, slide 16. 18, sorry, we've got different numbers. So you should see a slide called electronic reporting. I've talked a little bit about this already. TurboTax, I'm not endorsing them. There are other programs, but it's well known as a tool with built-in compliance assistance, tries to simplify tax reporting. It's key that electronic reporting must have a smart tool to guide the user. It's not emailing a PDF to the state or EPA. That's not electronic reporting. We get lots of benefits from electronic reporting. Accuracy goes up, so you can't report a pH of 15, right? If you report a number that seems way out of base, the software can prompt you and say, are you sure you wanted to report 1,000,000 pounds of benzenes? Because we know your emissions in the last 2 years were 10,000. So you can have a lot of sophistication built into the software. Ohio, NIPDES, that's their wastewater program, has gone to 100% electronic reporting for their discharge monitoring reports. EPA has a proposed rule out to convert to electronic reporting. EPA just put out a policy statement that says when we start new rulemakings, the default assumption will be electronic reporting, not paper systems. And this is a bit of a paradigm change, culture change, because even though electronic reporting is part of everybody's sort of personal, commercial life outside their government jobs, it hasn't yet made it as much into the environmental agencies. But this is to basically tell us that we're going to start with the assumption not of paper but electronic. It doesn't mean that we're always going to do electronic, but we're going to start with that assumption. And we do know that default assumptions eventually do carry a lot of weight. We also have a larger effort underway called e-Enterprise for the Environment. I don't have time to talk to you about all of that. But basically, that's a collaborative effort with the states and EPA. We have a senior leadership council to basically use advanced monitoring, information technology, business process modernization to drive environmental protection forward, to modernize. It's a collaboration between states. It's got a variety of things going on. We've just launched a leadership council in December, and I'd be happy to chat with you more about that, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to move forward. Slide 17 just very quickly shows Ohio's move to the NIPTES program, electronic. The key point I wanted to point there is that they saved 6 FTE, 6 full-time equivalents, and eventually non-compliance decreased. I'm going to move to the next slide on transparency. So just to recap, we've talked about rule effectiveness as the first component. We've talked about advanced monitoring and electronic reporting, and now we're going to talk about transparency.
You have until 3 p.m. I mean, to finish the session. So you have a little. You're fine on time.
Okay. Well, I was going to leave time for questions, and I assume there's 2 other speakers.
You have until 3.
I have until 3? Got it. Okay. So anyhow, so there will be time for questions because I'm going quicker. The fourth component is transparency. One example of transparency is EPA's ECHO site. It is by no means the only example. States have lots of examples of transparency. If you've ever bought a candy bar, you know what FDA transparency looks like, or if you bought a box of cereal, you'll see the FDA labels that show you how many calories of fat, how many grams. So that's transparency. So transparency is part of life. It's becoming more and more common. And you can drive better performance with transparency on the environmental front. You do have to design it carefully because it's not something you can do just quickly. You have to think about who's your audience for the information and what behaviors is the information actually going to induce. You should think about that and how do you get the information to them. So this is not something you can easily do often. You need to think about it. Let me talk about the Safe Drinking Water Act Consumer Confidence Report as one example. So for those of you who pay directly for your drinking water, so that means you don't live in a condominium or a homeowners association where the drinking water bill is paid by somebody else. Generally, you should get once a year something called a Consumer Confidence Report. And it reports on the quality of your drinking water pursuant to an EPA regulation implemented by the states. And it tells you over the course of the year, here's the source of your drinking water, here's the treatment, and here's the quality of the drinking water and how did we do meeting maximum contaminant levels, MCLs, or maximum contaminant goals. And it's a very useful report. And in a study when these first came out, they moved from consumer confidence reports that were posted on the old-fashioned business notice section of a newspaper. So those were pretty buried. And they compared those folks that were getting those to those who were getting a direct mailing of this more friendly report. And it found that a statistically significant regression analysis showed that the facilities, the drinking water facilities, that were now providing this direct report to their customers actually reduced their number of excursions. And it was statistically valid. So there's something about driving people's behavior that when they know somebody's going to be looking at what they do and that that person might care or might have an interest or some influence, it drives better performance. Restaurant health inspections have moved in many cities from detailed inspection reports, again in the business section where you read about a restaurant that you went to last week and you find out that the refrigeration temperature was 45 and they found little droppings on the floor. Instead of reading that, when you go to a restaurant, you often will see an A, B, or C, at least in the cities of San Diego, New York, and I think Los Angeles, and probably other cities, have moved to take information and make it more useful. And we think the literature shows and examples that as more attention is paid to data, its quality tends to improve. Slide 19, I'll talk a little bit more about. Slide 21, I guess, for those. So the BP oil spill had a lot of different things going on. But one thing, just focusing on the transparency, is there was a camera at the bottom of the ocean that was recording the spill, and you could click on the internet and watch the spill. And people did. I can't claim I spent a lot of time doing it, but a lot of people did watch it. And some of us think this was just another incentive. And there were many incentives on BP to clean this up quickly. But this was just another incentive that even though you might not see the oil at the surface because it was churned up in the warm weather, you could still see it coming out the bottom. There are some state examples where they've also done transparency. New York State passed a law, and they're implementing regulations, where within 4 hours of a publicly owned treatment works, that's a sewage treatment works, if they have a overflow or some type of excursion, they have to let the immediate community, the government, their consumers know by some electronic means. I think they were considering voicemail, email, texts. They were not considering notices in the newspaper 1 year later, but something much more real time. I think Connecticut has a similar law. The state of Ohio puts generic permit conditions. Its generic permit conditions requires a sign on each outfall. So instead of burying outfalls and making smokestacks, put them in places where people can't see, can you make them more transparent? Could you add a webcam to most smokestacks? It would be even nice to have it be an infrared webcam. And there is at least one country, I think, in Europe that does this, that has webcams on some of their smokestacks. The last transparency example is a picture in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River, I believe, looking out over the Key Bridge. And that thing that sort of looks like a stoplight, and it's red now. You see the lights red. So that means there was a combined sewer overflow discharge. If you're not in the water program, that's basically a mixture of raw sewage and stormwater runoff for systems. And that's telling you that's happened and is ongoing. So that's flashing as the discharge happens. The light goes to yellow the next day and stays yellow for a couple of days, and then it goes to green. And this is positioned so boaters can get visible, quick information on really the quality of the water right now. And this is just an example of transparency. This was part of a settlement with the District of Columbia, and they have 2 of these. But this technology is becoming cheaper, both on the actual monitoring side and the IT part of it as well. So the next slide talks about our last component of next generation compliance, innovative enforcement. So we've gone through 4 of them, and this last one, innovative enforcement, you can break it up into 3 pieces really. You can use next-gen tools in a case settlement. And I have some examples, we'll talk about that. And the example I talked about before, Port Arthur in Texas, is where we used advanced monitoring to find the violations. There's advanced monitoring by the facility at the fence line, and there's public transparency. So these are being used today. There are state cases as well in Texas where they've required fence line monitoring and public transparency as well. There's enhancing targeting and data analysis. Some of you might call this big data. How can we do a better job of using the information we have, the information that other people have, to come up with better ways to target our inspection and our enforcement actions. And you can have completely new enforcement approaches where perhaps you announce that after so many violations, you're definitely going to take an enforcement action. In the drinking water program, we were able to do that. 74% reduction in serious violators. In the flaring program for Clean Air Act, we're looking at how we've done enforcement alerts combined with enforcement actions, and we're not quite yet done with the results of that, but to try something innovative as well. So I want to go to the next slide. So just one example of an enforcement case with some next generation compliance components. A settlement with PP Whiting in Indiana. We had fence line monitoring. They report the fence line data weekly. It's continuous, and it's available for public review. Another settlement, I'm just giving you the highlights of these. In Sunoco, next slide, in Philadelphia. Again, we had fence line monitors, continuous emissions monitoring, community ability to see the data. So next slide, I'm going to switch and go to sort of what we think of as some of the key points for states. So before I jump into this slide, so again, next generation compliance has 5 components. I've walked you through the rulemaking, permit making, designing compliance in, advanced monitoring equipment, electronic reporting, transparency, and finally enforcement cases. All of those overlap, they complement each other, and they don't replace traditional enforcement. They're really a supplement, a new way to drive compliance so that our traditional enforcement cases are still used and are very much part of the mix for especially addressing the most serious violations. So what does next generation compliance mean for the states? And some of these are posed a little bit more as questions and for discussions. We expect that it will improve your ability, the state's ability, to implement programs with your resource constraints, the same ones that we have, and basically allow us to do a better job protecting the environment. As paper-based reporting becomes electronic, burden reduction for the states is expected. For industry, we'll have better data quality. We do acknowledge that electronic reporting does have an initial cost of building the systems. We've looked at grant programs to help the states with that as well. But over the long term, and it's generally the payback period for electronic reporting is 3 to 7 years, depending on the system. Over the long term, electronic reporting will vastly improve our world of environmental protection, and we don't even really have a choice. I mean, the world is moving to electronic, and we're really playing catch up. Advanced monitoring will give everyone better information. One of the things we've said is that, as the public is out there and they're looking at problems and they report violations, apparent violations to the state office or the EPA regional office, if they had better tools to do this, and some of the monitoring equipment is becoming more handheld, there's a whole host of sensors out there that are being developed, we'll have better information from sources, from states, from EPA, from academics, from researchers. This should give us better information to do our job. Next slide. So we think transparency, in a democracy, and if you think of the customers of environmental protection are really the citizens who are trying to protect, and some of you may say, no, it's the regulated entities, and that we could discuss that, but we could probably agree that both groups are important. As we have better transparency, citizens will have a better sense of what their government and industry is doing. Regulated entities will have a better sense of what they're doing and what their competitors are doing. And people will also have a better sense of how the government is doing. And we think sharing information will drive improved program performance. I should say that there will be some hiccups, and sometimes the scrutiny that seems good on transparency for the other guys, when it's focused on yourself, you may sort of say that's not so good. So overall, transparency is a great driver of improved behavior. It's been around since at least the TRI program when it was called the Sunshine Law. And so this is really, we think, will make a tremendous difference in improving environmental protection. And the last set of bullets are important here. So if we have better data on environmental conditions from advanced monitoring, we can share the existing data we have from electronic reporting. We can share the advanced data, monitoring data with electronic reporting. We may finally get to the point where we can measure compliance rates, environmental conditions, pollutions. So we might be able to have measures of, as Michelle started to get into, measures that address what's the compliance status, what's the pollutant loading into this airshed or this water body. And that means the number of government inspections, the number of government enforcement actions is no longer our sole measure of our program performance. We can start looking at what we've always wanted to do, which is outcomes. We're not there yet. It takes a lot more work, but that's really where we'd like to move. And if you can focus on outcomes, improving compliance outcomes and reducing pollution, then we can try more experimentation. You can try different approaches. Does a training program, a mandatory training program, drive compliance? Does mailing brochures to a facility drive compliance? The data that we have from just a couple of programs shows that just mailing information voluntarily to facilities doesn't improve compliance. But mandatory training programs, mandatory reporting programs do drive compliance, and we have some data on that. But you'll be able to experiment as you have better data. And we think that's a really important area that we're looking forward to get to. I don't think we're there today, and we can talk about when tomorrow we'll be there, but we are really looking to get there. And my last slide talks about states as innovators. A lot of the examples of next generation compliance are pulled from things states are doing today that EPA has not yet embraced. But there are a lot of states, whether it's New York, Connecticut, or Colorado, or New Hampshire, California, or Texas, you all have done things that exemplify and show how next generation compliance could work. So what we're trying to do is integrate this. We have 5 components that I've talked about. We'd love to learn from states what they're doing. Most of what we've learned so far has been ad hoc. As we go out and we talk, our regional offices or a state will say, I'm doing this. And in some cases, I've given presentations where I've said, wouldn't it be nice if somebody did that? And somebody in the state audience raised their hand and said, we do that today. And so you'll see those slides now on. So that's sort of an ad hoc way of learning. We're looking for ways to get information from states on what's working with them in a more rigorous way, but we're not looking to do an information collection request or formal request. So we're going to rely on sort of informal networks for now. We may compile a report of the best practices we've seen of states in air, water, waste, chemicals, and share it with the states and say anything to add. So we may ask you to comment on a draft report as a way to sort of get more information. And we love to have states propose a pilot to us that you'd like to work with. The pilot to demonstrate something in next generation compliance requires us to give you some flexibility on something else. We're willing to talk about that. We think our compliance monitoring projects policies do give you some flexibility. But if you have an idea for something and you need some help or assistance from us, we'd like to talk about it. I can't in the abstract say our response, but we are definitely open to talking about it. So that's an overview of next generation compliance. I went quick because without any exposure to the audience, it's hard to talk for a long time. So I'd rather open it up for questions, and I know there are other speakers as well after this.
Great. Thanks so much, David. We appreciate that. We do have a few questions here, and feel free for those listening in to submit some more questions. But one of the first questions we have is, how far will these innovative enforcement measures stand in court? I think the question they're trying to get at is, with these new technologies and new gathering of data, and some of these aren't new, as we know, a lot of it's just gathering what's already there. But will this? How do you perceive it being used in court? I mean, with more data, a lot of times comes more scrutiny, as we know. But has the agency thought about that?
Yes. So I think the question is getting at, so you go out there with advanced monitoring equipment that's not yet fully tested. Could you get that information into a court of law to prove a violation in a case? So I'm reworking. So that's one question. And it depends. There's a legal test under the Supreme Court for what you have to prove that your scientific method has been generally accepted. Some of the technologies, infrared cameras, are pretty well out there. So there are some, we haven't gotten to the point where we've had to prove violations, but the lowest level is your information good enough to persuade a facility that there's a problem? And I should tell, usually it is. And then it ratchets it up from there. Is it good enough to put in a complaint? Usually it is. Will you win in a court of law? Can you present it as evidence? Usually the answer is we can present it as evidence. Then there's the question of whether it's going to be persuasive. But again, the court use of this advanced monitoring equipment is is the very sort of end of the bell curve. That's sort of, we don't end up in court that much. Can we persuade a facility that they have a problem that they should fix? And the answer is often yes. And we're seeing in some of the cases technology that we started piloting, vendors are now going out and selling companies on them, and a lot of companies are buying it. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. If not, I suppose they will submit another question and tell me that.
But yeah, I mean, we've definitely talked about this, and I'm trying not to get too legal, but there's a Supreme Court test for whether you can get evidence into court. And some of our advanced monitoring technology easily passes that because you can say there's a scientific, I'm doing this without any paper, so there's a scientific consensus, it's been proved, it's reliable for the purpose. And some of it is still on more of the innovative side, and it might be harder. But our folks usually are aware of the limitations on that. And in some cases, we're actually moving to get new technology used enough and verified and published that it becomes not new technology, but the standard technology. That process takes some time. Other questions?
Great. Another question we have is next generation compliance being applied to the revisions of NSPS, municipal waste landfills, WWW, which I'm not sure what that means, but you probably do. Currently in the process at EPA, it now has, the commenters said it now has subjective limits.
So I really can't, I don't want to comment on a rule that's in proposal because I'm not going to create a record. But in general, EPA is trying to apply the concepts of next generation compliance, rule effectiveness, into our new rules as we go forward. And in some cases we're being successful. In some cases there are other drivers where we may be stuck perhaps with a more subjective, complicated standard. So the rule-making process and the permitting process, it's a long-term adventure. And I can't tell you, I don't know enough about the specific rule you're asking me, but there are some examples of rules that we're getting there. And if you guys see proposed rules that you think are not consistent, you guys have, you can comment and say, what's going on here? Those would be helpful comments.
Great, thank you. Another question is, how do you, when you're talking about transparency, how do you envision the data portals working? I mean, we want to, I think you mentioned we want to be able to gather in real time, and obviously posting that perhaps on the EPA's website or such, but as we know that it's difficult to get things up and running like that. So do you have an approximate, what do you think, I guess, about the portal or data portals, and what timeline do you have one with trying to get that up and running?
So I think the question is asking about the portals that we're envisioning under e-enterprise, because I didn't use the word portal, so I'm assuming somebody has heard me talk about portals under e-enterprise. So let me answer that question first with a little bit of background. So we've talked about creating portals, working with the states for both public access and regulatory program access. So as somebody perhaps submits advanced monitoring data, normally it would go to the state. The question is, can we make it available to the public? Can we make it available to EPA? How can we do that quickly? And I think it's usually going to start with what's the existing systems that support that. But it might not end there because it might be new systems. And the other thing to think about for advanced monitoring is it may not come in just to the government. Some of the monitoring may be done by sources outside EPA, outside the states, and it may come in, and this might scare some people, into a Google group or into a Facebook team or some social sharing site for data that EPA and the states are not running it. And I think that will make some people nervous. I think it's actually fine. We'll have to work through that. But I think you're going to see monitoring data coming quicker to EPA in the states, and we'll be looking at ways, whether it's a portal or a website or making it available to app developers to get the information out. We'll be balancing the need for QA, data quality checks, with people's expectations of timely data. So data that has gone through 6 months of QA no longer gives you reliable information on the air you're breathing today or yesterday. So we'll have to balance those, and it will probably vary by programs and by needs. There's an application called Air Now that you can get on your, I think like your iPhone or your Android phone, that provides emissions monitoring data that the states and EPA collect. And I think we've agreed that when we put it out, we don't run it through all of the QA checks that we would for the National Emissions Inventory annual reporting, but we try to give people more real-time information. Other questions?
This is just a generalized question. I think one of the, as we know, as we look through, I think a general, and this is my question, states have the responsibility of helping gather some of this data, and we talked about the costs and the shrinking budget. And you talked about over time you think this is going to be a cost savings. Can you just maybe speak through that or to that a little bit more? I know that budgets is always on everyone's mind, and since we have a little bit of time here, if you wanted to elaborate on that point.
Sure. We think, I mean, next generation compliance is basically an investment in the future. So for electronic reporting, you do need to invest in the infrastructure for smart tools to help people report. And EPA is trying to find the funds and the grant funds to support that, and we're trying to do that through e-enterprise. Better design of regulations is not usually a cost, does not increase our cost. It requires the people who are designing regs and permits to think differently, but it doesn't necessarily drive up our cost. In fact, it should be cost neutral. And in the end, it should reduce our costs, because if we can have rules and permits that drive compliance through monitoring and transparency and better structures, then the resources that we have for inspections and enforcement actions will go longer. And again, a lot of transparency in today's age is not that expensive, and there's ways to get to avoid the government need to build a system. So for example, if you're settling a case in a state with a defendant, and you don't have a tool for them to post their annual monitoring data that you want as part of your settlements, and it's any decent-sized company or municipal entity, they have a website. So you could require the source to post it on a website. You simply require them to use some magic words, otherwise known as index words. You might require that they only post it no more than 3 clicks from their homepage. Use common words like air pollution monitoring report. And then other people might build tools that access this. So there are ways in the short run, before we have the infrastructure on IT, to build it out using company websites. I mean, obviously, that can only go so far. So we do need to be creative. Resources is very much on everybody's mind, including EPA. But again, some of this is thinking differently, not so much new costs or additional costs.
Great. Thank you. That was helpful. We had another question. This goes back to the electronic reporting that we were speaking about earlier. The question is, do you worry about quality assurance on real-time data that is publicly available?
No, there are data quality assurances with data that's submitted on paper that we then spend days, weeks, months analyzing. So I don't know that I have those major concerns about the quicker the data comes in. And if it's coming in electronically, you can have some QA built into the system. And the QA might, B, obviously you can't report a pH out of range. It could flag numbers that appear inconsistent with this industry's past performance or inconsistent with what we expect. So the data, the tools that people report by and the systems that receive them can do a lot of this initial scrub so that it can flag outliers. The question is, we're never going to have enough resources to look at each piece of data that comes in and ask all the questions we'd like. That's probably not the world we live in, and I'm again using we as states and EPA. So we're going to have to sort of rely on some electronic checks on the data. For that data that's showing compliance, that determination usually still needs to be made by a human being, often in the state. We're not suggesting that's not going to happen. That should still happen. But giving people access to the data before it's been fully QA'd, we just need to tell them about that. We put caveats out so they know about that. And again, this question is hard to ask in the abstract because you need a data stream so you know what you're talking about. So in some cases we may say, absolutely, we need more checks. But in many cases we may say the automatic algorithms may capture 95% of the problems and let it go at that.
Thank you. Another question we have is, who will pay for the third-party compliance evaluations?
So that's an excellent question. Usually the way third-party programs are set up is the regulated entity pays for it. It's part of their legal obligation. So if you're in Massachusetts and you happen to own a hazardous waste site or a brownfield, you have to hire a licensed site professional, LSP, that's been verified to state, and they basically have to evaluate your cleanup program, your plans. They make the verification, they submit to the state, you don't submit, and they charge you for this. So that's the program that's out there. So in most cases, third-party programs, the regulated entity pays for them. Think about, for those of you who live in non-attainment areas for mobile sources, you take your cars in, right, and most likely, I've never heard of a program different, you either pay the state that's running the inspection program to test your car, or you pay the automobile repair shop. So it does switch the cost more to the regulated entity. I can't off the cuff think of programs where the third parties are paid by the taxpayers.
In India, the Indian program.
Yeah, but not domestic. Yeah, so domestically, I can't think of examples where where somebody else pays for it. And there are advantages if somebody else pays for it in terms of better quality data, but in general, the regulated entity is either going to pay into a program that allows this to happen or is going to have an individual contractual relationship. The data would suggest that if you pay into a pool, and then you're assigned a third party to do the verification, you would probably get more objective data. But most of the programs, at least in the U.S., the third party picks their verifier and pays them. It's the most I'm aware of. And I think, for example, if you look at FDA organic programs, I think it's the farm that wants the organic certification that pays the third party to verify. So the key is to make sure that the third party has some independence, there are standards, the third party reports to the government, and then in the third party program, the government's job is to basically regulate more directly the third party. That's where they're focusing the sources. And remember, the reason why you do a third party program, and I may not have mentioned this, is if you have several million sources and there's no government inspection compliance program possible, but you could have maybe 1,000 third parties run the program. The government program is then to evaluate mostly those third parties. And in the example I just made up, so that our universe is now 1,000, we have to worry about the verifiers. We might occasionally send them test samples that are in or out of compliance. We might drive a car in that's out of compliance and make sure the gas station fails the car. But we're not worrying about the larger universe so much. We're focusing on the smaller universe of the third parties. And I should say, the government doesn't focus on the third parties, it's probably not going to be a very effective third-party program if there's nobody watching the third parties. And that's usually the government's obligation.
Okay, thank you. That was a very thorough answer. It was a good question, too. Well, that is all of the questions that we have. And so we appreciate your time, David and Michelle. And